Hi, and welcome back to Reddit Whispers. My name doesn't matter, but my story does. For 8 years, I thought I knew everything about my wife, Celestine. We met during our final year at university, both studying literature. She had this way of analyzing characters in novels that made me fall in love with her mind first, then everything else followed. Celestine was brilliant, ambitious, and had these deep green eyes that seemed to hold secrets I was eager to discover. Back then, I thought those secrets would be beautiful surprises, childhood memories, or dreams we'd build together. We married 2 years after graduation. The wedding was small but perfect, her idea. Celestine never liked big crowds or being the center of attention, which I found endearing. She preferred intimate dinners, quiet bookshops, and long walks where we'd discuss everything from philosophy to our future children's names. We settled into a comfortable routine in our modest apartment downtown. I worked at a marketing firm while she taught high school English. Life felt stable, predictable, and exactly what I thought I wanted. The first few years were genuinely happy. We traveled when we could afford it, hosted small dinner parties for close friends, and talked about buying a house. Celestine would grade papers at the kitchen table while I worked on client presentations, and we'd share stories about our days. She had this laugh, this genuine, throaty laugh that would fill our small space and make everything feel right. I remember thinking we were one of those couples who actually made it work, who found their person and built something real together. But somewhere around year 5, things started shifting in ways so subtle I almost missed them entirely. Celestine became more protective of her phone, taking it with her to the bathroom, keeping it face down during dinner. She started working later, staying after school for what she called curriculum planning or parent conferences. When I'd suggest picking her up or bringing her dinner, she'd decline quickly, saying she had a ride or wasn't sure when she'd finish. These weren't red flags exactly, just small changes in our routine that I attributed to her growing dedication to her job. The distance grew gradually. Our conversations became more surface level. She'd ask about my day, but I could tell she wasn't really listening to my answers. When I talk about work stress or share something funny that happened, her responses felt automatic, like she was going through the motions of being interested. The intimacy we once shared, both physical and emotional, became sporadic and felt forced when it happened. She'd kiss me goodnight, but it felt like kissing a roommate rather than a wife. I tried addressing it directly several times. I'd ask if everything was okay, if she was happy, if there was something we needed to talk about. Celestine would reassure me that she was just stressed about work, dealing with difficult parents, or worried about budget cuts at the school. Her explanations were always reasonable, always delivered with just enough emotion to seem genuine. She'd even make an effort for a few days afterward, cooking my favorite meal, initiating conversations about our future, being more affectionate. But then she'd gradually drift back into that distant space that I couldn't seem to penetrate. The phone calls to her mother became more frequent. Celestine had always been close to her family, particularly her mother Isabel, who lived about 2 hours away in the suburbs. Growing up, Celestine spent summers there, and even as an adult she'd visit every few weeks. I'd often join her, and Isabel treated me like the son she never had. These visits were always pleasant, home-cooked meals, stories about Celestine's childhood, walks around the neighborhood where she grew up. But suddenly, Celestine was visiting her mother every weekend. She'd leave Friday evening and return Sunday night, explaining that Isabel was going through a difficult time since her husband, Celestine's stepfather, had passed away the previous year. This made perfect sense. Grief is complicated, and Celestine was naturally compassionate. She wanted to be there for her mother during this transition, helping with household tasks, providing company, being the supportive daughter I'd always admired her for being. I offered to come along on these trips multiple times. I knew Isabel enjoyed my company, and I thought it might help us reconnect as a couple while also supporting her mother. But Celestine would gently decline, saying these were important mother-daughter bonding moments, that Isabel needed to process her grief with family first before including others. She'd promised we'd go together soon, maybe for Isabel's birthday or a holiday, but those occasions never materialized the way she described. 3 months into this new routine, I decided to surprise them both. It was a Friday evening in October, and Celestine had left for her mother's house around 6 o'clock. She'd seemed distracted while packing, checking her phone repeatedly and taking longer than usual to choose what to wear for what she described as a quiet weekend of helping with garden cleanup and organizing old photographs. Something about her energy felt different, not excited exactly, but anticipatory in a way that didn't match visiting a grieving mother. I had a particularly good week at work, closing a major client that I'd been pursuing for months. The bonus would be substantial, and I wanted to celebrate with the two most important women in my life. I imagined surprising them with expensive wine and takeout from that Italian place Isabel loved, maybe staying the weekend and helping with whatever projects they had planned. It would be spontaneous and romantic, the kind of gesture I thought might help bridge whatever gap had formed between Celestine and me. I stopped at the wine shop, choosing a bottle I knew Isabel particularly enjoyed, then grabbed dinner from her favorite restaurant. The drive to her house took exactly 97 minutes. I'd made it enough times to know precisely. I was feeling optimistic for the first time in months, imagining Celestine's surprised smile when I walked through the door, her mother's delight at the unexpected visit, and the comfortable evening we'd spend together talking and laughing like we used to. Isabel's house was dark when I arrived. Completely dark. No lights in any windows, no car in the driveway, no signs of life whatsoever. I sat in my car for several minutes, confused and trying to rationalize what I was seeing. Maybe they'd gone out to dinner, or for a walk, or to visit neighbors. Maybe Isabel had decided to stay with relatives for the weekend and Celestine had gone with her. There were logical explanations for an empty house. But Celestine's car wasn't there either. And something about the stillness of the house felt wrong, not temporarily empty, but genuinely unoccupied. I called Celestine's phone, and it went directly to voicemail. I tried twice more with the same result. Then I called Isabel's landline, letting it ring until the ancient answering machine picked up with a message that sounded like it hadn't been updated in months. I decided to check with Isabel's neighbor, Mrs. Chen, an elderly woman who'd lived next door for decades and kept track of everyone's comings and goings. She was surprised to see me, immediately asking if everything was all right. When I explained I was looking for Celestine and her mother, Mrs. Chen looked confused. "Oh, honey," she said, "Isabel left for her sister's place in Phoenix 3 days ago. She'll be gone for 2 weeks, some kind of family reunion. She asked me to watch the house while she's away. Are you sure Celestine said she was coming here?" The ground felt like it was shifting beneath my feet. I thanked Mrs. Chen, made some excuse about miscommunication, and sat in my car trying to process what I'd just learned. Celestine had lied to me. Not just tonight, but potentially for months. If Isabel was in Phoenix, where had Celestine been spending all those weekends she claimed to be helping her grieving mother? I drove home in a daze, my mind racing through possibilities I didn't want to consider. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe Celestine had gotten her dates confused, or maybe Isabel's trip was last minute and they'd made other plans. Maybe Celestine was visiting other relatives, or had decided to spend the weekend alone somewhere, needing space she didn't know how to ask for. I was grasping for innocent explanations, but they all felt flimsy against the weight of what I'd discovered. The house was empty when I returned, exactly as I'd left it. I poured myself a glass of the wine I'd bought for Isabel and tried calling Celestine again. Still voicemail. I texted her, "Hey, tried to surprise you and your mom tonight, but she wasn't home. Call me when you get this." I tried to make it sound casual, like I wasn't completely unraveling inside. I didn't sleep that night. I kept checking my phone, waiting for her response, imagining what she might say when she finally called. Would she have a perfectly reasonable explanation that would make me feel foolish for doubting her? Would she be angry that I checked up on her? Would she lie again, creating an even more elaborate story to cover the first lie? Saturday morning came without any word from her. I called again around 9, then again at noon. By evening, I was genuinely worried that something terrible had happened. What if she'd been in an accident? What if someone had hurt her? The rational part of my brain knew that if there'd been an emergency, I would have been contacted. But the anxious, sleepless part of my brain conjured worst-case scenarios that made my chest tight with panic. Sunday evening, exactly as she'd done for the past 3 months, Celestine came home. She walked through the door at 7:30, carrying her overnight bag and looking refreshed in a way that made my stomach turn. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and immediately started talking about her weekend, how emotionally draining it had been helping her mother sort through old belongings, how they'd made progress on organizing the basement, how Isabel was slowly starting to heal but still had difficult moments. I listened to every word, watching her face, trying to detect any signs that she knew I'd discovered her deception. But Celestine was completely natural, completely convincing. She asked about my weekend, sympathized when I mentioned feeling lonely without her, and suggested we order pizza and watch a movie together. It was a performance so seamless that I almost doubted what I'd learned from Mrs. Chen. Almost. But I knew what I'd seen. An empty house, a neighbor who confirmed Isabel had been gone for days, and a wife who was lying to me with an ease that suggested this wasn't new for her. The question now wasn't whether Celestine was deceiving me. It was where she'd really been, and what I was going to do about it. The week that followed was the longest of my life. I went through the motions of normalcy. Work meetings, household chores, conversations with Celestine about mundane things like grocery lists and weekend plans. But underneath the surface, I was conducting my own investigation, trying to piece together a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to complete. I started paying attention to details I'd previously overlooked. The way Celestine would disappear into the bathroom with her phone for 20-minute stretches. How she developed new preferences, different perfume, clothes I'd never seen before, music she claimed to have rediscovered from college. She'd always been evolving, growing, changing. That's what I'd loved about her intellect. But these changes felt different, like she was becoming someone I didn't recognize rather than deepening into herself. Her car became my first real clue. On Tuesday evening, while she was grading papers in the living room, I casually mentioned that her car looked like it needed washing. She glanced up briefly, agreed absently, and returned to her work. But when I actually looked at her odometer the next morning, the numbers told a different story. In the past month alone, she'd driven over 800 miles more than her daily commute and our usual errands would account for. 800 miles! That was 4 trips to her mother's house, or 2 very long drives to somewhere much further away. I began documenting everything in a small notebook I kept hidden in my desk at work. The time she left and returned, the excuses she gave, the mileage on her car, the new charges on our joint credit card that I'd previously attributed to her growing interest in self-care, lunches at restaurants I'd never heard of, purchases from clothing stores in parts of the city she had no reason to visit, spa treatments that seemed surprisingly frequent for someone who'd never been particularly interested in such things. The credit card statements became a roadmap of deception. While I was at work, Celestine was apparently living a completely different life. Expensive lunches at upscale restaurants, shopping trips to boutiques in the financial district, purchases from lingerie stores that made my stomach clench with the implications. The woman I'd married was practical, budget-conscious, someone who researched purchases for weeks before buying anything non-essential. This spending pattern belonged to someone else entirely. Friday arrived with its familiar routine. Celestine packed her bag, kissed me goodbye, and promised a call when she arrived at her mother's house. She never called, of course, but she texted around 8:30 saying she'd arrived safely and that Isabel sent her love. I stared at that text for a long time, wondering how someone could lie so effortlessly, how she could invoke her mother's love while using her as cover for whatever she was really doing. This time, I was ready. I'd taken Friday afternoon off work, positioned myself at a coffee shop with a clear view of our apartment building, and waited. Celestine left at exactly 5:47, just as she had for the past month. Instead of heading toward the highway that led to her mother's house, she drove downtown into the heart of the city's business district. Following someone in traffic is harder than movies make it seem. I had to stay close enough to keep her in sight while remaining far enough back that she wouldn't notice my car in her mirrors. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it over the radio. Part of me hoped she'd turn toward her mother's neighborhood, that there was some innocent explanation I hadn't considered. But she didn't. She drove straight to the most expensive part of downtown, where corporate executives and wealthy professionals lived in converted lofts and trendy high-rises. She pulled into the parking garage of a building I recognized, one of those sleek, modern complexes that advertised luxury amenities and panoramic city views. I parked across the street and watched the entrance, trying to decide what to do next. Confronting her immediately felt reactive, emotional, like it would give her the opportunity to create another elaborate explanation. But waiting felt like torture, sitting with the knowledge that my wife was somewhere above me, probably with someone else. I waited 2 hours. At 9:30, they emerged together from the building's main entrance. Celestine and a man I didn't recognize, walking close but not quite touching, the kind of careful distance that suggests intimacy constrained by public space. He was tall, well-dressed in that effortless way that speaks of real money, with graying hair and the kind of confident posture that comes from never doubting your place in the world. They stood talking for several minutes, and even from across the street, I could see how animated Celestine became around M, more alive than she'd seemed at home in months. He walked her to her car, and they embraced. Not a friendly hug, but something longer, more intimate, his hand lingering on the small of her back in a way that made my vision blur with rage. She drove away first, and he returned to the building. I sat in my car, shaking, trying to process what I'd just witnessed. The woman I'd married, the person I'd built my life around, was having an affair. Not just physically, but emotionally. She was happier with him than she'd been with me in months. I drove home and paced our apartment until she returned Sunday evening, full of stories about helping her mother organize closets and cook meals for the week ahead. She showed me a photo on her phone, a casserole she claimed to have made with Isabel. I knew it was probably from a restaurant, or maybe from his kitchen, but I nodded and complimented her thoughtfulness. I was becoming complicit in her deception, playing my assigned role in the elaborate theater she'd created. Monday morning, I called in sick to work and drove back to the building where I'd seen them together. I needed to understand who this man was, what he represented in Celestine's life. Whether this was a recent development or something that had been building for longer than I wanted to imagine. The building's directory listed dozens of residents, but no names meant anything to me. I waited in the coffee shop across the street, hoping to see him leave for work, to get some sense of his routine. He emerged at 8:15, walking with the unhurried confidence of someone who controlled his own schedule. He was older than I'd initially thought, probably mid-40s, with silver threading through dark hair and the kind of tan that suggested regular vacations to expensive places. He drove a black BMW that looked like it cost more than I made in a year. I followed him to a law firm downtown, one of those white shoe establishments that occupied entire floors of premium office buildings. It took some creative online searching, but I eventually identified him. Marcus Ashworth, senior partner at Ashworth, Blake & Associates, specializing in corporate mergers and acquisitions. His firm's website featured him prominently, describing his expertise in handling multi-million-dollar deals and his involvement in various charitable organizations. He was successful, established, probably wealthy beyond anything I could provide. He was also married, according to the family photo displayed in his professional biography. A blonde woman and 2 teenage children, all of them looking like they belonged in a country club catalog. This discovery should have made me feel better. Surely Celestine wouldn't want to break up a family, wouldn't want to be the other woman in someone else's marriage. But instead, it made everything worse. This wasn't some spontaneous attraction or temporary lapse in judgment. This was a calculated affair with someone who had as much to lose as she did. Someone who could provide her with a lifestyle I'd never be able to match. I spent the following weeks living in a strange state of hypervigilance, documenting everything while trying to maintain the pretense of normalcy. I tracked her lies with forensic precision, the restaurants where she claimed to have lunch with colleagues but actually met him, the evening faculty meetings that coincided with his late office hours. The weekend trips to help her mother that lined up perfectly with his wife's out-of-town travel schedule, which I had learned about from his law firm's newsletter. The most painful part wasn't the betrayal itself, but watching how effortlessly Celestine maintained her double life. She'd return from her secret meetings refreshed and energized, sometimes even more affectionate toward me, as if her happiness with him overflowed into generosity at home. She'd cook elaborate dinners, suggest weekend activities, even initiate intimacy with an enthusiasm that felt simultaneously wonderful and devastating. I was benefiting from her affair, receiving the emotional spillover from whatever fulfillment she found with him. I considered confronting her dozens of times. I'd rehearse conversations in my head, calm, rational discussions about honesty and our future, or explosive confrontations where I'd present all my evidence and demand explanations. But something held me back. Maybe it was fear of what would happen after the truth came out, or maybe it was the pathetic hope that if I gave her enough time, she'd end it herself and return fully to our marriage. The breaking point came on a Thursday evening in late November. Celestine was grading papers at the kitchen table, humming absently while she worked. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and I watched her face transform as she read it, the same expression of anticipatory joy I remembered from our early relationship, when my messages could make her light up from across a room. She typed back quickly, smiling in a way that made my heart break. "Work stuff?" I asked casually. "Just Sarah confirming tomorrow's department meeting," she replied without looking up. "Boring administrative things." But I could see her phone screen from where I sat, and the message wasn't from Sarah. It was from a contact labeled simply M, and it read, "Can't stop thinking about last night. Tomorrow can't come soon enough." Her response, which she typed while lying directly to my face, was a heart emoji. That night, after she fell asleep, I finally made my decision. I couldn't continue living this half-life, pretending ignorance while my marriage disintegrated around me. But I also couldn't confront her with just suspicions and speculation. If I was going to end this charade, I needed irrefutable proof. I needed to see exactly what I was dealing with, to understand the full scope of her betrayal before deciding how to respond. I was going to follow them again, but this time I wouldn't just observe from across the street. This time I was going to get close enough to document everything, to gather evidence that would make denial impossible. Whatever happened next, at least we'd finally be dealing with the truth. Friday morning, Celestine kissed me goodbye with the same casual affection she'd shown every day for months, promised to drive safely to her mother's house, and walked out of our apartment carrying the overnight bag she'd packed with clothes I'd never seen her wear around me. I gave her a 15-minute head start, then followed her into the most devastating day of my marriage. Following Celestine that Friday felt different from my previous surveillance attempts. This time, I wasn't hoping to be wrong. I wasn't looking for innocent explanations or ways to rationalize what I might see. I was armed with a small digital camera, a voice recorder, and the grim determination of someone who'd finally accepted that his marriage was already over. I just needed to document how it had died. She drove straight to Marcus's building, just as I'd expected. But instead of going to the parking garage, she pulled up to the main entrance where he was waiting for her. Even from a distance, I could see how her entire body language changed when she spotted him. She practically bounced out of the car, and he embraced her with the easy familiarity of lovers who no longer needed to hide from each other, at least not in this space they'd carved out for themselves. He handed something to the valet, money, probably a generous tip, and they walked into the building together, his hand possessively placed on her lower back. I managed to photograph this interaction, though the distance made the images somewhat grainy. What struck me wasn't just the physical intimacy, but how natural they looked together, like a couple who'd been together for years, rather than secret lovers stealing moments between their real lives. I knew I couldn't follow them into the building, too risky, too obvious. Instead, I positioned myself in the coffee shop across the street and waited. I'd brought a book as camouflage, but I couldn't focus on the words. My mind kept racing through possible scenarios. Were they in his apartment? Was he showing her a life she could have if she left me? Were they making plans for a future that didn't include the husband she'd been deceiving for months? They didn't emerge until late afternoon. When they finally appeared, everything about their appearance suggested they'd spent hours in intimate comfort. Celestine's hair was different, more tousled, and she was wearing a blouse I'd never seen before. Marcus had changed clothes entirely, now dressed casually in expensive-looking jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than my monthly car payment. They looked refreshed, happy, completely at ease with each other. Instead of heading toward her car, they walked down the street together, stopping at an upscale restaurant I recognized from our credit card statements. Through the restaurant's large windows, I could see them being seated at a corner table, clearly regulars based on how the staff greeted them. I found a position across the street where I could observe without being noticed, and what I witnessed over the next 2 hours fundamentally changed my understanding of what I was dealing with. This wasn't just physical attraction or a midlife crisis. They were having a relationship. They talked constantly, leaning toward each other across the table, sharing food, laughing at private jokes. Marcus reached across to touch her hand repeatedly, and she responded with the kind of unconscious intimacy that develops over time. When she excused herself to use the restroom, he watched her walk away with obvious affection. When she returned, he stood to pull out her chair, a small gesture, but one that spoke to established patterns of behavior. I managed to get several clear photographs through the restaurant window, Celestine raising her wine glass in a toast, Marcus kissing her hand across the table. The two of them sharing what appeared to be an inside joke, both of them laughing in a way that made me realize I hadn't seen her genuinely happy in months. These weren't stolen moments between people consumed by guilt. They were comfortable, established, planning for something beyond the immediate gratification of an affair. As the evening progressed, my anger began mixing with something more complicated, recognition that whatever she had with him was probably more fulfilling than what we'd had together in years. The woman I was watching wasn't the distracted, increasingly distant wife who'd been going through the motions at home. This was someone animated, engaged, fully present in her own life. The painful truth was that she seemed more like herself with him than she had with me in a long time. They left the restaurant around 8:30, walking slowly back toward his building like people reluctant to end their time together. In front of the entrance, they had what appeared to be a serious conversation. I could see Marcus gesturing, apparently explaining something, while Celestine listened intently. Then she nodded, stood on her toes to kiss him properly, not the careful peck she'd given me that morning, but a real kiss between people who loved each other. She drove away alone, but instead of heading toward home, she went to a hotel downtown, one of those boutique places that cater to wealthy business travelers. I watched her check in, then sit in the lobby for about 20 minutes, frequently checking her phone. Marcus arrived shortly after 9, and they went upstairs together. I couldn't follow them, obviously, but the implication was clear. They weren't just having afternoon trysts anymore. They were spending entire nights together, creating the kind of extended intimacy that transforms an affair into a relationship. I drove home and spent the night staring at the photographs on my camera, trying to process what I documented. These images told the story of my marriage's end, but they also revealed something I hadn't expected: genuine love between two people who weren't me and my wife. Whatever moral judgments I wanted to make about adultery and deception, I couldn't deny that Celestine looked happier with Marcus than I'd seen her look in years. Saturday morning, she returned home at her usual time, carrying her overnight bag and wearing the same clothes she'd left in the day before. She greeted me with a kiss on the cheek and immediately began her familiar routine of describing her weekend with her mother. The meals they'd cooked together, the photo albums they'd organized, the progress Isabel was making in processing her grief. Every word was a lie, delivered with practiced ease. But something was different this time. There was an energy about her that she couldn't quite suppress, a lightness that hadn't been there before. She moved through our apartment like someone who'd made a decision, who was no longer torn between competing loyalties. She was more affectionate than she'd been in months, making my favorite breakfast, suggesting we go for a walk, even initiating physical intimacy that evening with an enthusiasm that felt both wonderful and devastating. Sunday evening, as she unpacked her bag, I noticed something that confirmed my worst suspicions.
Tucked between her clothes was a small jewelry box I'd never seen before. When I asked about it later, she claimed it was a necklace her mother had given her, something that had belonged to her grandmother. She showed it to me, a delicate gold chain with a small pendant that looked expensive and new rather than vintage. The final piece of evidence came Monday morning when I checked our credit card statement online. There was a charge I didn't recognize from Saturday afternoon, a purchase at an upscale jewelry store downtown for an amount that made me physically sick. Marcus had bought her a gift, and she'd brought it home to our apartment, added it to the jewelry collection I'd helped her build over 8 years of marriage. That afternoon, I made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I was going to confront her, but not in the way she'd expect. I wasn't going to lead with accusations or evidence. I was going to give her the opportunity to tell me the truth voluntarily, to see if there was any part of the woman I'd married who still existed underneath the elaborate deception she'd constructed. I came home early from work and found her in the kitchen, preparing dinner while humming absently, the same unconscious happiness I'd observed at the restaurant. She looked up when I entered, smiled genuinely, and asked about my day. For a moment, looking at her in our kitchen, wearing the apron I bought her for Christmas 2 years ago, I could almost pretend everything was normal. "Celestine," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, "we need to talk." Something in my tone made her stop stirring whatever she was cooking.
She turned to face me fully, and I could see her trying to read my expression, trying to determine what kind of conversation this was going to be. "Is everything okay?" she asked, and there was genuine concern in her voice. Concern for me, or concern that I'd discovered something she didn't want me to know. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me," I continued. "Are you happy? In our marriage, I mean? Are you happy with the life we've built together?" She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face. I could see her calculating, trying to determine what had prompted this question and how much truth would be safe to reveal. "That's a complicated question," she finally said. "Are you asking because you're not happy?" "I'm asking because I love you, and I feel like we've been drifting apart for months. I feel like there are things you're not telling me, and I want to understand what's happening to us." Another long pause. She turned off the stove and leaned against the counter, crossing her arms in a defensive posture I'd rarely seen from her before. "I think we've both changed," she said carefully. "People grow, and sometimes they grow in different directions. That doesn't mean anyone did anything wrong." "But has someone done something wrong, Celestine? Have you done something wrong?" The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. I could see her weighing her options: continue lying and hope I didn't know anything concrete, or confess and deal with the consequences. I was giving her the chance to be honest, to end this charade with some semblance of dignity intact. "Why are you asking me this?" she said instead of answering. "What's brought this on?" "Because my wife has been lying to me for months, and I need to know why." Her face went pale. For the first time since I'd started suspecting her infidelity, she looked genuinely scared. "What do you think you know?" she asked quietly. "I know your mother has been in Phoenix for the past 2 weeks visiting her sister. I know you haven't been spending weekends helping her grieve. I know you've been meeting someone downtown, spending time in his apartment, having dinner at expensive restaurants, staying overnight in hotels." I pulled out my phone and showed her one of the photographs I'd taken. "I know you're in love with Marcus Ashworth." She stared at the image on my phone, the two of them kissing outside his building, and I watched 8 years of marriage collapse in her expression. Not just the deception, but any remaining connection between us. She wasn't sorry I'd found out. She was sorry she'd been caught before she was ready to leave. "How long have you been following me?" she asked, and there was something almost like admiration in her voice, as if she was impressed by the thoroughness of my investigation. "Long enough to understand this isn't just physical. Long enough to see that you're happier with him than you've been with me in years." She set down the wooden spoon she'd been holding and looked at me directly for the first time in months, really looked at me, without the careful distance she'd maintained throughout her deception. "You're right," she said simply. "I am happier with him than I've been with you, and I'm not sorry about that." Her admission hung between us like a death sentence, not just for our marriage, but for any illusion I'd maintained about who she'd become. The woman standing in our kitchen, wearing the apron I'd given her, casually destroying 8 years of shared life, wasn't someone I recognized anymore. "I'm not sorry about that," she'd said, and those words kept echoing in my mind as I tried to process what came next. I'd expected anger, tears, remorse, desperate attempts to save what we'd built together. Instead, I was facing someone who seemed almost relieved that the pretense was finally over. "When did it start?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "6 months ago," she said without hesitation. "We met at a conference downtown. He was the keynote speaker, talking about corporate ethics, which sounds boring, but he made it fascinating. We started talking afterward, and she shrugged, as if the destruction of our marriage was just something that had happened to her, rather than a series of choices she'd made. 6 months, I repeated. Half a year of elaborate deception, of coming home to me after being with him, of planning a future that didn't include the man she'd promised to love forever. And you never thought about telling me? About ending our marriage before starting something with him?" "It wasn't supposed to become serious," she said, and for the first time since I'd confronted her, she looked uncomfortable. "It was just attraction, excitement, something that made me feel alive again. I thought it would run its course, that I could have both for a while and then figure things out. But it didn't run its course." "No," she admitted. "It got deeper, more complicated. Marcus understands me in ways that you—" She stopped, realizing how cruel she was about to sound. "In ways that I don't," I finished for her. "Go ahead, say it. I think we're past the point of protecting each other's feelings." She looked at me with something that might have been pity. "You're a good man," she said. "You're kind and reliable, and you've never done anything to hurt me. But we want different things now. We've become different people, and I can't pretend anymore that we still fit together." The rational part of my brain understood what she was saying. People change, grow apart, discover they're incompatible in ways they couldn't have predicted when they were 25 and thought love conquered everything. But the emotional part of me was screaming with betrayal, with the injustice of being left behind rather than included in her transformation. "What does he give you that I don't?" I asked, though I dreaded the answer. "Intellectual stimulation," she said immediately. "Challenge, conversations about things that matter to me. A lifestyle that matches my ambitions." She paused, then added more quietly, "Passion." Each word was a small knife. She wasn't just leaving me for another man. She was leaving me because I wasn't enough. Because the life I'd thought we were building together was too small for the person she'd become. "Are you going to leave me for him?" I asked. "It's complicated," she said. "Marcus is married. He has children. He can't just walk away from his responsibilities the way—" She stopped again, realizing what she was implying. "The way you can walk away from me?" I said. "Because I'm just a responsibility now, not someone you actually love." She didn't deny it. That silence was more devastating than any words could have been. "I need some air," I said, and walked out of our apartment without waiting for her response. I drove aimlessly around the city for hours, trying to process the end of the life I'd thought I was living. When I finally returned home around midnight, Celestine was asleep in our bed, curled up on her side of the mattress like nothing had changed. The normalcy of it felt surreal. She'd just admitted to a 6-month affair and told me she didn't love me anymore, and she was sleeping peacefully while I felt like my entire world had collapsed. I spent the night on the couch, staring at the ceiling and trying to figure out what came next. Divorce seemed inevitable, but I needed to understand the practical implications. Our shared apartment, joint bank accounts, the life we'd built together, it would all need to be untangled. More importantly, I needed to decide whether I wanted to fight for someone who'd already decided I wasn't worth fighting for. The next few days passed in a strange state of suspended reality. Celestine went to work as usual, but she stopped pretending she was going to visit her mother on weekends. Instead, she'd simply announced she was going out and wouldn't be back until Sunday. She was still living in our apartment, sleeping in our bed, but she'd essentially checked out of our marriage entirely. It was like being roommates with someone who'd once been the most important person in my life. I consulted a divorce attorney that Thursday. Margaret Chin, no relation to Isabel's neighbor, was a sharp woman in her 50s who'd been handling family law for decades. She listened to my story without judgment, took notes about our assets and lack of children, and explained the process in straightforward terms that made the end of my marriage sound like a business transaction. "The good news is that it should be relatively simple," she said. "No kids, limited shared assets, and if she's not contesting anything, we can probably have this finalized within 6 months." 6 months to dissolve 8 years of marriage. It seemed both too long and impossibly fast. "There's something else," I said, pulling out the photographs I'd taken. "I documented the affair. I have evidence of her relationship with this other man. Does that matter legally?" Margaret looked through the images with professional detachment. In a no-fault state like this one, adultery doesn't typically affect property division or alimony, but it can be useful leverage if she tries to make unreasonable demands. "What about the fact that he's married? Could I contact his wife, let her know what's been happening?" Margaret leaned back in her chair. "You could, legally speaking, but I'd advise thinking carefully about your motivations. Are you trying to protect another betrayed spouse, or are you looking for revenge? Because those are very different things, and one of them will help you move forward, while the other will keep you trapped in anger." I spent the weekend thinking about her question. Was I angry enough to destroy Marcus's marriage the way mine had been destroyed? Did his wife deserve to know the truth, or would I just be spreading the pain around? On Sunday evening, I made my decision. I found Marcus's home address through public records, a sprawling house in an exclusive suburb, the kind of place where successful attorneys raise their families behind private gates and perfect landscaping. His wife's name was Elena, and according to social media, she was involved in various charitable organizations and seemed devoted to their 2 teenagers. I drafted a letter explaining what I knew about her husband's relationship with my wife. I included copies of the most damning photographs and provided a timeline of their affair. I tried to keep it factual rather than emotional, though I'm not sure I succeeded entirely. The letter sat on my kitchen table for 3 days while I debated whether to send it. The decision was made for me on Wednesday evening when Celestine came home with an announcement that changed everything. "Marcus is leaving his wife," she said without preamble as soon as I walked through the door. "He's filed for divorce and moved out of their house. We're going to be together properly now." I stared at her, trying to process this development. "What about his children?" "They'll spend weekends with him. He's rented a place downtown, close to his office. It has enough space for when they visit." She was talking about dismantling his family with the same casual tone she might use to discuss weekend plans. "And what about us?" I asked. "I want to file for divorce as soon as possible," she said. "I've already spoken to a lawyer. If you don't contest it, we can have everything settled quickly." The speed with which she'd planned our dissolution was breathtaking. While I'd been agonizing over whether to contact Marcus's wife, Celestine had been systematically dismantling both of our marriages so she could start fresh with her lover. "Have you thought about what this means?" I asked. "You're destroying 2 families so you can be with someone you've known for 6 months." "I'm choosing happiness," she said simply. "For the first time in years, I'm choosing what I actually want instead of what's expected of me." That night, I mailed the letter to Elena Ashworth. Not out of revenge, though I can't claim that wasn't part of my motivation, but because she deserved to know the truth before her life was completely upended. If Marcus was already leaving her, she at least deserved to understand why. The response came faster than I'd expected. Elena called me 2 days later, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and gratitude. "I knew something was wrong," she said. "He'd been distant, working late, taking unexplained trips. But I trusted him, believed him when he said it was just work stress." She paused, then added, "Thank you for telling me. I know this couldn't have been easy for you."
We met for coffee the following week, two people trying to understand how our spouses had decided we were disposable. Elena was elegant, intelligent, clearly devastated, but handling it with more grace than I probably would have managed. She told me that Marcus had presented their divorce as a mutual decision, claiming they'd grown apart and wanted different things. He never mentioned Celestine. The worst part isn't even the affair, she said. It's how easily he lied to me, how he convinced me that ending our marriage was somehow for my own good, that he was setting me free to find someone better suited to me. As if 20 years of marriage was just an inconvenience he was kindly helping me escape. I understood exactly what she meant. The betrayal wasn't just about Celestine choosing someone else. It was about how effortlessly she'd rewritten our entire relationship as something that had been holding her back, rather than something we'd built together. 3 months later, both of our divorces were finalized. Celestine moved in with Marcus immediately, and according to mutual friends, they seemed genuinely happy together. They traveled frequently, attended cultural events, lived the kind of sophisticated urban lifestyle that apparently fulfilled her in ways our quiet domesticity never could. I won't lie and say I handled it all with dignity and grace. There were nights I drove past their building, wondering what my life might have looked like if I'd been more ambitious, more intellectually challenging, more whatever it was that Marcus provided that I couldn't. There were days I resented how easily she moved on, while I was still trying to figure out who I was without her. But gradually, I began to understand something Margaret Shen had tried to tell me during our first meeting. Sometimes people fall out of love not because someone did something wrong, but because they've become incompatible in ways that can't be fixed. Celestine hadn't set out to destroy our marriage. She'd simply outgrown it, and she chose to pursue what fulfilled her, rather than resign herself to a relationship that no longer served either of us. That doesn't excuse the months of deception, the elaborate lies, the way she let me believe we were working toward the same future while she planned a different one entirely. But it does explain it in ways that allowed me, eventually, to let go of the anger and focus on rebuilding my own life. 6 months after the divorce was final, I ran into them at a bookstore downtown. Celestine looked radiant, animated, completely comfortable in her new life. Marcus had his arm around her waist, and they were discussing something with the kind of intellectual intensity I remembered from our college days. When she saw me, she smiled, genuinely, warmly, and introduced me to Marcus as her ex-husband. "We've heard so much about you," Marcus said, extending his hand with no apparent discomfort. "Celestine speaks of you very fondly." It was surreal, this civilized interaction between three people whose lives had been fundamentally altered by the choices we'd made. But it was also oddly healing. They weren't monsters who'd set out to hurt people. They were just two people who'd found something together that they couldn't find in their existing relationships. "I hope you're happy," Celestine said before we parted ways, and I could tell she meant it. "I'm working on it," I replied, and I meant that too. A year later, I can say that I am happy, or at least content, in ways I wasn't sure would be possible during those